Alright, time shoots back to 2005. What's happening over here? YouTube is first created. I'm sure that'll be a fun video sharing app for the foreseeable future and not a greedy corporation that puts a million unnecessary restrictions on its creators. Georgie Bush is still president, the Harry Potter boys all have long hair now for some reason, and everyone is bumping that one Eminem song where he sticks a gerbil in his ass. I assume. I feel like that's definitely the one that resonated with fans. Through all this mess, two other things are happening here in 2005. A little game is released by the name of Psychonauts, and I'm probably off pissing my pants in kindergarten. When Psychonauts released, gaming wasn't really a part of my life unless you count Freddy Fish in the Case of the Haunted Schoolhouse, which I played maybe 600 times for whatever reason. And once I did start playing games, I never actually owned a console that had Psychonauts on it, so while I was aware of its existence, I never actually played it. Very recently, I did get a console that has this game on it through backwards compatibility, and I had planned to play it by now knowing that Psychonauts 2 was coming out, but I just never found a good time between other games and schoolwork and videos to do it. So that leads us to the situation we're in now. I've played through Psychonauts 2 and never touched the absolute cult classic game Psychonauts 1, which I promise I'll do soon, but as of now, this is the situation, alright? Now, why was this whole preamble important? Why'd I go out of my way to explain all of this? Well, because I think a lot of people are actually in a very similar boat to where I am. Although, not the Freddy Fish part. I feel like that was some kind of fever dream or a fish-themed coping mechanism from the depths of my 5-year-old brain. With Psychonauts being fairly old at this point and not being incredibly popular on release, at least sales-wise, I think a lot of people out there have heard of it but never played it. And I'd argue that with Psychonauts 2 being on Game Pass on release, the amount of people that are interested in the sequel is dozens of times more than the amount of people who actually touched the original game. And because of that, I thought that it might be good to make a video from the perspective of somebody who's in that same position. I'm free of the nostalgia for the first game, I don't know the pre-existing lore, I only had a basic understanding of what the story was like going in, and so I'm basically able to talk about this game differently than I've seen in other reviews online, which are usually coming from people who have at least played the first game. For anyone who hasn't played the original and wants to know if they'd still love this game like everyone seems to be, I'm basically here to answer that question for you. Spoiler alert, the answer is yeah, almost definitely, but let's dig a little bit further into why. Psychonauts 2 definitely makes me understand why Psychonauts 1 was a cult classic and never really hit the mainstream near release. Let me explain. This game doesn't have the tightest or most engaging or toughest platforming, it doesn't have anything special going on in the combat department, its character models are intentionally rudimentary, and the game is far from a graphical showcase despite its lofty and ambitious world designs and bright color palettes. It honestly doesn't have a lot of the things that we would assume make a really good game nowadays. And because of this, the first few hours were just okay to me. I really liked the general idea of the game, the plot, the way that the levels were themed around the characters whose brains you were exploring and what problems they had, etc. But the pacing was thrown off with the start and stop gameplay since there were so many short cutscenes sprinkled in everywhere and you didn't get any extended playing times. It was like if you hit 9 red lights in a row on a single road. It was a little bit frustrating at first, and also the gameplay itself was not super engaging when you did get to play it. It was kind of dead simple and not really much of a challenge, which is fine for the beginning of a game, but it did keep this going for a few hours. The set dressing that came with the different locations, especially when you entered your first big mine section, were fun and they contained tons of cool visuals and unique gameplay moments, but the stuff you were exploring early on wasn't nearly as emotionally engaging or as interesting of an idea as what came later in the game. Mild spoilers here, but I don't think it's too bad since this is the beginning of the game. Basically, you accidentally go into your teacher's mind and give her a gambling addiction. Her brain used to be filled with events circulating her research at a hospital and is now hiding that hospital motif under the guise of the stuff that you'd find in a casino. You have an x-ray machine with cards in it, people are trying to get lucky with their goal of bearing a child. You bet on races that take place inside of heart monitors. It's a really cool setting, don't get me wrong, but because the gameplay was so by the books and more importantly there wasn't as big of an emphasis on telling an emotional story in this level, it didn't really get me hooked. I think part of that was because the gambling addiction was something that we manipulated this character into. We see it at a very surface level. It hasn't ruined this character's life or anything yet, it's just been introduced to them for now and we fix it shortly afterwards. Also, going through this level and connecting different ideas in people's minds so that they stop taking unnecessary risks and instead focus on smart decision making, again, very surface level. From what I've heard of Psychonauts, it deals with some interesting themes in genuinely interesting and thought-provoking ways, so I was a little worried here when I saw that it was handling this stuff so boringly, I guess? Or maybe more childish is the better term for it. And while all of that wasn't enough to turn me off from the game entirely, all of its average moments were pointing towards this game being average with maybe some fun locations. But the game very quickly showed me why it and its predecessor have garnered such amazing feedback from players and critics, and it really stems from two main things. One of which was already taking shape in those first 2 hours and became even more prominent after that, and one that came about when the game introduced more characters with more deep-seated issues. And those two things are the game's world building and its expert visualization and exploration of the human psyche and the mental issues we go through. Psychonauts 2 really fleshes out its universe in a way that makes all of its weird, wacky rules and ideas super simple to follow and believable in context. It's not just a matter of having everything be Psy-themed, Psy-lyrium, Psychonauts, Psycard, Psytanium, Psyduck. No, wait, sorry, not that also, hold on, what the heck? Psychonauts has the type of world that feels truly well thought out and unique, where you can feasibly see the reasoning behind everything going on around you, which is what a lot of the best fantasy locations in media tend to do. All of the enemies are named after things that could potentially plague your brain, judgment, censorship, doubt, and all of their attacks are perfect matches of how those ideas tend to affect us. They stamp you with censor marks or slow you down or drop anchors on you. The collectibles are figments of a person's imagination, so they're crude and not fully formed or super present. You also have emotional baggage tucked away in certain corners, and safes which contain certain memories that the person seems to have locked away as they cause them too much pain. The levels, like I said, are themed after the person's mental state and what their issues are, and because of this you get such a wide array of locations, but they all wind up feeling authentic because a lot of these locations are direct parallels to the personalities of the characters you're meeting. You enter through brains using this door portal thing, you're able to connect ideas and thoughts to one another. You have this unique brain pattern called the thinker print, which is obviously a play on fingerprint, and that's the thing that is basically scanned to see if you can access certain areas. It's a lot cooler than just using your fingerprint on a keypad, and it makes way more sense with the whole psychic theme. There's a whole conflict between the psychics and your family who are part of the circus, and that both adds a nice layer of depth to Raz's motivation, something that I'm sure was explored a lot in the first game, while also expanding this world past this one base of operations and just past the psychic characters. Areas apart from the Mother Lobe all have unique qualities to them with some little side stories or details, monsters that live in the woods, or the fact that everything in the questionable area, which seems to be themed after creatures that may or may not exist, kind of like if we in real life had a theme park for Sasquatch and the Loch Ness Monster, has a question mark beside it. Every single sign or whatever has a question mark. It's like it's not sure whether the parking is actually this way. Very in line with the whole questionable area theme. Seeing Raz through the eyes of other beings makes him look different, like the rat sees him as this crazy looking monster thing. A character whose mind is fractured has shards of glass in his brain. Everything in this game has a real sense to it. It feels incredibly well thought through, and despite missing out on the whole first game, though they do give you a brief rundown of it in the start of this one, I did feel like I had a deep understanding of this world and its rules and a sense for things that we don't even get to see outright in front of us, just from the game doing such a good job of making sure everything in this world has a purpose to it. Not a single corner of this game's world feels unintentional. For such a crazy universe, this meticulousness is really important, especially for a newcomer. I never felt like I was lost or confused on how things work, despite dropping into the series halfway. And I also have to shout out the fact that despite them doing such a great job getting me to easily understand all the intricacies, that didn't mean that the game world started getting bland after a while. When the game introduced new ideas or powers or anything, it didn't feel boring and predictable, it served as a deeper expansion of this world. A good example being when Raz has to use bacon to get some dude who's apparently living in his head out of his noggin. This whole thing came out of nowhere. I didn't even know anyone was living in my head quite literally rent-free, or that you could even do that in this universe, but it also kind of made sense. It was a good mixture of keeping me on my toes and introducing weird stuff all the time, but not having it feel out of place or just being goofy for the sake of being goofy. Him being in there has a reason to it, and his character is a real highlight of the game. And speaking of characters, I feel like this is a good way to bridge onto the other point that I wanted to expand on. Psychonauts has really colorful characters that often have very sad backstories, and as a result, a lot of the time your goal is to help this person come to terms with the issues that they're having. You don't just go in there and remove their problems outright, you instead guide them through their trauma and help them overcome it. In fact, the one time it feels a bit more like you're just straight up going in there and fixing a person is the first big mission with the whole gambling problem, which I think is why I found it a little bit less engaging than the rest. Now, in retrospect, I actually do like how they did this because A, the problem in their brain was a direct result of me meddling and changing their mental connections, so it wasn't a deep-rooted issue that this character developed, it was a manufactured one, and going in there and reversing that makes a lot of sense. And also B, this event shows Raz that he can't just go in and change people to what he wants to be. He needs to be a lot more of a guide than a repairman, which he does start to do later on. So in the full context of the game, this is a good mission, but at first it might seem a little childish or simple, and I'm glad it was used for just narrative purposes and didn't become the norm for the game, because when the game begins to get more nuanced with the whole brain exploration idea is where we really start to see the other strength of this game absolutely shine. For this section, I think it's a good idea to focus on a specific level and discuss how it pulls this off so effectively, and I think the best one to pick, considering it's one of my favorites and still relatively early on in the game, is the Psy King level. Now, this is getting to mid-game territory here, so fair warning, if you haven't played this game yet, while I'm not going to be spoiling the outcome of this level or diving too deep into some big story points, in order for me to discuss this, I do need to explain the premise, talk about a specific encounter, and allude a little bit to some of the big story points. So while I'm definitely going to be keeping spoilers light, if you do want to go in with some blindness to anything that isn't the opening sections, I would say maybe skip to the next chapter. With that said, this is the level where I fell in love with this game. Basically, Raz right now is just trying to look for a brain to shove into somebody's empty head so he can access some room. Don't ask me why, it makes sense in the game, okay? You pick up this unassuming brain from a storage facility and you enter it and you run into this small ball of light that's been chilling in here, and it's clear that it's been here for a very long time and has no recollection of anything past the inky blackness in which it now resides. Once you shove this brain into that dude's cranium, though, all of a sudden he experiences the world again, and it's mesmerizing and captivating to him, and almost instantly becomes way too much, and he experiences a sort of sensory overload. And so at this point you're like, alright, I gotta go into his brain and check on him, and all of a sudden the colors and style of the game change a little bit. It's like somebody took the regular game you've been playing and just shot up every single one of the color sliders. This level is plastered with intense and vivid colors, and just from this change in the game's look, you're conveyed the Psy King's perception of the world pretty effectively. It's a tad bit overwhelming to look at. It's almost like a child puked out his imagination. There's flying fish and rainbows everywhere. And the dilemma going on in the brain right now is that there's this whole crowd outside waiting for a performance named Feast for the Senses. Unfortunately, if you try to go out and face this crowd, it leads to you getting pelted by the audience. The level has a lot of stuff it deals with throughout, but the most apparent one is clearly anxiety. Stage fright is a very well recognized emotion and probably the most obvious instance where an individual would feel anxious. And I like how they combine this with the whole Feast for the Senses idea to create a more complete picture of anxiety in general and not just stage fright. Your goal here is to basically bring together the band to perform in front of these people, and that band is made up of your senses, like feel and vision and audio and stuff. The Psy King basically has to collect himself, like actually collect his senses and be more in tune with them to handle the crowd, otherwise it's way too much and he gets booed off. A lot of the time with anxiety, it can be really helpful to focus on specific senses and lock in on them. Find one thing to focus on in the room and block everything else out. Start describing it in your head in simple terms. You basically try to remove yourself from the constant barrage of information hitting your eyes and make things as binary as possible. And I think this level and this story conveys a lot of that really well, all while eventually tying this together with the story going on the outside, which, to keep it vague, these senses actually have real-world parallels to the friends that this character used to have. But I won't get too deep into that because of spoiler reasons. Back to the level design itself, the power that you learn here is one that allows you to slow down time. And for somebody whose brain is clearly going a mile a minute, this is pretty damn appropriate, and it's displayed best through this new enemy that's introduced here, Panic Attack. Now, while that name isn't exactly subtle, that's sort of the point, the execution of this enemy is brilliant. This thing will basically come out of nowhere and take up all of your focus and attention. I compared the normal level here to a sensory overload, and if that's the case, then with this enemy it turns into a critical malfunction. You all of a sudden stop seeing the normal world around you and instead get placed into this arena that's hard to see in. It's very kaleidoscopic. And the speed and aggression of this enemy is clearly way too much to handle, and the Psy King's natural response is to go back into the inky black void. It became too much for him and he just wants to get out of here. Really, the only way to actually beat these things is to use that slow down time ability. And again, in a real life panic attack, a common tactic that people use is trying to control their breathing and slow it down. Just sort of bring their heart rate down a little bit, count backwards maybe. These obviously aren't the end all be all solutions, but they can help a lot. And likewise, Psychonauts 2 isn't giving us solutions to our problems, but it's depicting them in really interesting ways, being respectful to these issues and showing how important it can be to have a guide and a helping hand when you're going through these things. I also like how in the resolution to this story, which I won't be showing here and I'll be keeping things vague still, they make it clear that some of his reconciliations, his understanding about what happened with his friends in real life, is not actually real. His friends talk to him and explain certain things, but this is all taking place in his mind. No one's actually talking to him. He didn't need people to explicitly tell him why he should get better despite his trauma, he just needed to understand it and accept it and move past it himself, which is a really mature take on the subject. From enemy names to the story to something as small as color changes, this game takes the concept for exploring people's minds and absolutely nails it. Everything feels so authentic and real and fantastical yet relatable. Every part of every level works together to build the actual mind of a character that we see, and I think this is the beauty that so many people see in this franchise. Psychonauts 2 isn't the best platformer this year, it's not the best action game this year, it's not the best looking game this year, it's not the most revolutionary game this year, and yet it's still absolutely one of the best games to come out this year. It doesn't put its focus on a lot of the go-to things that you would associate with a great game, but it thrives off of its creativity, mature yet fantastical storylines, its tight grip on world building, and its unique way of using gameplay and visuals as key components to its narrative. In my linear storytelling video that I made recently, I talked about games that were able to use linearity to perfectly craft this experience that was personal to you, but it was still curated by the developer, and how that could lead to you understanding and experiencing new perspectives and ideas in genuinely interesting ways, and this is exactly what I was talking about. As someone who, I'll be honest, has had a lot of issues with anxiety before, it was really nice seeing it be explored in such an inspired way here. And even in places where I didn't have similar problems to the characters, I did feel like I understood them and their issues throughout this game. The game doesn't whack you over the head with mental health issues. I think some games get lost in the weeds and overdo it and feel less like a genuine exploration of these issues in a creative way that can also stand on its own merits, and instead feel like the game is just hitting you with feel bad, look how sad this is, see, are you seeing this, cry bit. Obviously not all of them are like this, but the ones that are kind of ineffective at their message. But Psychonauts curbs that criticism while also having a lot more to offer to the player, like I mentioned earlier, and it comes together to form a very different experience, which I liked for very different reasons than I like most games, but that made me really happy. And it kind of proves that you don't need to follow a specific formula to make a good game. Play Psychonauts 2, even if you haven't played Psychonauts 1, I promise it's worth your time.